It was right before Christmas. It was December, Christmas time. And we'd always have a huge family party. I was 10 years old. I was playing Sega Genesis with my brother. And I heard this like loud boom on the floor. I was like, what was that? And I heard it again. I paused the game and walk out in the hallway, and I come out to see my mom jumping up and punching my dad in the face, my dad grabbing her and slamming her to the ground, and they're having this huge fist fight, right? And I just run out. I'm 10 years old. I'm like 50 pounds and like 3 feet tall. And I'm like crying, and I'm like, stop it, stop it, stop it. You know, like what? And like, this is just the environment. So obviously, to me, there's no safe place. There's not a place of comfort, right? I tended to take the brunt. I have a younger brother. I was always jealous of my classmates, like how they can show up to school and look like, you know, they'd just be bored sometimes to be there. But I'm like so anxious, you know, all the time. I don't remember like my first, give or take, 9 years of life at home, which is usually a sign that things were pretty bad.
Trauma is any experience that we have that overwhelms our ability to cope with it. It overwhelms the ability of our brain and nervous system to adjust and self-regulate to what's happened. The human brain is the least developed organ in the body at the time of birth. Neuroscientists tell us that our brains are shaped and formed around experience. Childhood trauma and abuse disrupts the neurodevelopment of the brain, predisposing children to lifelong mental and physical health problems. But children who have at least one supportive person in their lives do better. And children who have a strong support system, and a support system that is there for them during a time of crisis, are able to heal from the traumatic event.
My life had been so brutal, and every single day was the same, where I wasn't sleeping. I was having these panic attacks, and I was like, why am I going to try and live another 70, 80, whatever math years if every day is like this, right? Because I'm little, so I'm not able to think things can change, or that eventually I'll leave the house.
It also now gets into depression, right? Where now you're starting to feel a sense of helplessness, and then the more concerning one I have is hopelessness, where now, you know, what is worth living? And now we start getting into, along with the depression, suicidality, and things like that.
And I was like, what is the point of being around? And so I ended up locking myself in a guest bathroom in our house. And we had one of those big bottles of Tylenol, you know, with however many hundreds of pills. And I was just going to swallow them all and die. I just remember looking out the window when I was about to take the bottle. And I looked out the window, and I just had this imagery flash of my mom finding me dead on the floor and how devastating that would be to her. And I just remember, you gotta remember, I was 9, 10 years old. I just remember taking the bottle and like slamming it down. And I was like, I'm not gonna do this, but I have no idea what I'm gonna do when I leave this bathroom. Like, what am I gonna do the rest of my life?
Children don't know how to be in this world. They're learning from parents. So as parents, we need to be able to let the children know, I'm right here, you're safe, I'm walking this journey with you, you're not alone. And that helps feel that they're safe in the world. So as they get older, they feel safer in relationships, and they feel safer overall. They can be more successful and experience less anxiety.
And I think what makes me angry when I got older was like, nobody ever asked. The school counselor was involved, school nurse, doctors, all kinds. I was having all kinds of physical problems. Nobody ever asked about my home life, ever. They just looked at me as an anxious kid because I got good grades. I was really smart. I didn't have to try hard in school. So they to me, they were like, what's wrong with this kid? You know, like, he's really bright. My report card looked good. So they never made any assumptions in that way. And so for me, it was just this, nobody ever asked. What's going on with this kid behind the scenes, that he comes to school, he throws up every morning because my stomach would be in such knots.
someone who does abuse or who is abusive in nature often presents very differently. So they have what they call cluster B personality types, which would narcissism would fall under that. And people do not suspect that they would be like that. And then the person who is getting abused feels like no one would ever believe them that that's happening.
I spent my whole life thinking like everything was my fault. Like, I got yelled at for everything you can imagine. If the salt shaker fell out the table, it was because it was my fault. I shook the table. If I didn't tie my shoe right, it was because I was an idiot. Everything was my fault, to the point where I would walk into stores, like back in the day, like Kmart, whatever, and I felt like I was already doing wrong and security was watching me. Even though I was not stealing, I was going to pay for it, but my mindset was like, I'm so wrong and always the bad guy that even when I show up to a store willing to pay for a video or a new t-shirt, they're watching me because they think I'm going to steal and I'm going to get yelled at. And so that was the level of like intensity of my thoughts.
There are also instances where people experience it and then they became the abuser afterwards, because it's about control and power more than not being able to manage yourself.
His dad was brutally violent and like frankly evil in the things he did, and I won't share the stories because they'll keep you up at night, but his childhood and adolescence was very brutal. So like as an adult I can understand his story, and he did better than certainly his dad. But that became my passion, was like, it ends with me. And I didn't know what I was signing up for when I declared that. But I was like, I won't be a man like this.
When you look in the mirror, so to speak, you are a reflection of the environment that you've come from, directly or indirectly. And that could be good or bad, traumatic or not. And when you think about, as you become an adult and you're at that stage of your life where you want to build a family or be in a relationship with someone, you're going to reflect in that relationship what has been deposited inside of you. Now, the true identity of that person can change when they make the decision to actually say, you know what, the reflection that was given to me isn't good.
Forgiving my dad was a recurring issue, because just like the Israelites going around the mountain, my guess is they learned something hopefully in those 40 years. And every time you grow and develop as a person, you peel back the onion and you learn more about your story and you as a human.
Everybody can change. That's the beauty of our mind. That's the beauty of how God created us. There's this ability for us to be adaptable and flexible and nuanced, to be able to change if you're willing to.
I really had to accept God as the father, as my dad, and allow him to father me in a way that I didn't understand and know was possible. Like to have a man who wanted to hang out with his beloved son and take joy in what I'm into, not like force me into what you're into. And it took a long time, but then also allowed me to get to this place of forgiveness of my dad, of knowing more of his story, the struggles he's had, and the things that he can offer and did offer, right? And it wasn't like we always had food on the table. There was a roof on the house, 2 Chevrolets in the driveway, classic middle class operation. And but I had to get to this place too of how do I understand his story, forgive him, and also accept what he did, and where do I go from here? Because if I keep wanting him to be the dad that I not want and needed, he's going to keep failing because he hasn't figured that out for himself. So I'm setting him up for failure and myself for disappointment.
Forgiveness is a personal choice, and it's really about relieving ourselves from the emotional attachment to that trauma, to that experience. And sometimes we hesitate to forgive because we think it's about the other person. We think it's about releasing them from what they did. And the reality is, it's about me. Can I forgive what happened so that I can release myself But it doesn't mean that we minimize the experience. And it doesn't mean that we have to then reconcile with the person who caused the pain. It just means we can still stay away from that and acknowledge this really affected me, this traumatized me. And yet I choose to release these emotions so that I don't continue to carry this burden on me.
On acceptance, I can now accept my dad and mom for who they are as human beings and the struggles they've had, because I'm not looking to them anymore to be that kind of role. I can still be respectful and honor them for who they are, but I can go to God in whatever part of the Trinity, how you want to look at that, and they meet my needs. And I don't have to go through life anymore alone, feeling alone at least.
How do I deal with that? How do I recover from that? And so one of the things I know that we've done research on is resilience. Took it a step further from Dr. George Everly, who coined us as psychological body armor. And so basically what we're talking about is two pathways of dealing with resilience, our ability to be able to deal with trauma. So one area is what we call proactive resilience, where we're building some kind of immunity. So some of those areas would include like what you do to build your spiritual wellness is one of those areas. One of those areas would be your perception of meaning for you. Would say happiness, also how you allow yourself to be happy are that proactive pathway. The reactive pathway is now how do we bounce back? How do we find ways to help us to bounce back from adverse experiences? And usually now we're talking about, okay, physical activity, doing some physical activity, exercise, walking, those things are important. Nutrition also now becomes important in helping us. But we also are talking about sleep and getting quality sleep. We're also looking at the importance of social support systems is key in that area, along with how do you manage stress? How do you manage, things that, can hit home, such as that can make you sad. So we talk about depression and those kind of things. So we have these two pathways, kind of a unique way of responding, both important, but also both things that we can do to help build our ability to deal with trauma.
And it's taken me probably a 10-year healing process to really accept of where I am and who I am as a man.
Only when we are brave enough to explore the darkness will we discover the infinite power of our light.
50% of those who have a mental health diagnosis have a history of abuse or trauma. 80% of those with a serious diagnosis have a history of abuse or trauma. So trauma has a significantly negative impact on mental health and well-being. But the most important protective factor is social support. People need others in order to heal.
All good trauma therapy involves talking through what happened. And so there's some exposure, but it's exposure within the context of a trusting relationship with a therapist or a pastor or whoever you happen to be talking to.
I crossed paths with a man, he's a friend of mine now, and he married me and my wife, Pastor Steve Horrell. He was my first kind of counseling inner healing person, and he brought me these healing memories and me being able to see like God was there. I was never hung out to dry and alone, and even though I was in a brutal environment, he was there with me going through it all too.
Childhood trauma is not the end of the story. The person isn't irreparably damaged forever. In fact, many people who experience childhood trauma become some of the most resilient and resourceful people. But it will take, I think, intentionality and effort.
I remember going through a healing memory moment where my dad had pinned me to the wall, and he would choke me, and he'd look at me with his teeth gritted and be like, "Do you want me to blank and kill you?" And he'd wait for me to answer. And then I'd be like blacking out, and I'd be like making peace of the fact I'm gonna die. And so then I kind of nudge my head like, no, and then he'd just drop me like a sack of potatoes and walk off. But when I was doing a healing memory with Pastor Steve, I was there with Jesus, and Jesus was on the wall with me, and he helped bring my dad's hand down, and then he cradled me after the fact, and that broke me, man. I remember crying so much that I was wearing beige shorts like this, and I left and it looked like I had peed myself because I had cried so much, and realizing like, man, God was always there.
God has a very difficult job, and that job is to let us come to the place where we can see sin for what it really is. And sin is essentially unfair, it is essentially cruel, and Satan likes to cause suffering. And God has to let him do that in order to show us his true colors.
I met my wife, we were just friends. You know, we were like practically best friends for like 2.5 years. But that allowed me this very slow process. But I've already decided I'm not going to be like my dad, so I'm not going to lash out, I'm not going to yell, I'm not going to be violent, I'm not going to cuss at you. So that leaves me in this place of I got to look inward at the man again in the mirror. And am I willing to do that? Yes. Am I going to need a few minutes to maybe calm down? Okay, cool. But I will address this. And that became my thing. Like, I'll tackle this. You know, I'll address it. I moved here, I was making $10 or $11 an hour, man. I never made like quote unquote good money. I was renting rooms from friends. I had a car that was like 20 years old with 250,000 miles. I was working so much on me, but no one on the outside world sees that. All my friends back home in New Jersey and around Florida, they're married, they got a new car, they're moving into their first house, maybe they're having a kid, they're getting their new profession. I had nothing. And that's how cool God is, and my time is immaterial to him. In regard, he'll do what he wants. Within 6 months' time, I finished my master's degree to become a mental health counselor. I got my quote-unquote professional job. I got married, and I got my first house and a newer car in 6 months. So it's like, if you'll just trust the process, let God do his thing, accept the rolling hills, that they're not going to be the speed you may want all the time, but he'll do his thing. And so I tell people that, I'm like, man, trust the process. Let the story unfold.
We are hard pressed on every side, yet not crushed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. I love that because God doesn't deny how hard life is. He doesn't deny how overwhelming trauma can be. He doesn't deny that our losses can sometimes feel like the very foundation of our souls has been swept away in an indifferent, fast-running river of tragedy. He doesn't deny those things. He doesn't deny the pain and the suffering. But he says, I've imposed limits, cast down but not destroyed. But there's something that gets better. It says, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. And that's talking about the growth of character, how we grow in love throughout life. It's a beautiful message that God can continue to make us flourish internally, even though we're sort of doomed to these fallen bodies, you know. In other words, there's a point to all this. God is doing something specific through this suffering, and we can count on him to bring that to pass, and something good is going to come out of all of this evil. We can count on that.